Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. For those in-house, we would ask if you would make that last courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off. It is most appreciated. We will, of course, post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference following today's presentations. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send their questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our program this afternoon is Amber Smith. Amber is a writer and commentator. She provides expert analysis on national security, military affairs, foreign policy, and veterans affairs on national TV shows on Fox News, Fox Business, MSNBC, a great challenge, I'm sure, and others, as well as an array of publications. She is a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum and a senior military advisor for Concerned Veterans for America. She served in the United States Army as an OH-58D Kiowa Warrior helicopter pilot in command and air mission commander for almost 8 years in the 101st Airborne Division. She is a combat veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, and she has her Master's of Science degree in Safety, Security, and Emergency Management with a concentration in Homeland Security. It's my pleasure to welcome Amber to Heritage, and the podium's yours, Amber.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'd like to introduce as well our experts for the panel today, and I will start with the author of Surviving the End, which is why we're all here today. James J. Carafano is the Vice President in Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for National Security at the Heritage Foundation, where he leads the think tank's policy initiatives on national security and foreign policy. As an expert on foreign affairs, defense, intelligence, and homeland security issues, Dr. Carafano has testified before Congress, has published multiple books, textbooks, and articles, and is a highly sought-after speaker and media figure on issues related to his field. A 25-year Army veteran with a degree from West Point and a master's and doctorate from Georgetown University, Dr. Carafano also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, and the Institute of World Politics. Jennifer Marshall, on the end there, is the Vice President of the Heritage Foundation's Institute for Family, Community, and Opportunity. In that capacity, she oversees research into a variety of issues that determine the strength and character of American society. She also edits Heritage's annual Index of Culture and Opportunity, which tracks key social and economic trends to determine whether important indicators of opportunity in America are on the right track. She has spoken at national and international forums, testified before Congress, and appeared on numerous radio and television shows. She is also the author of Now and Not Yet, Making Sense of Single Life in the 21st Century. Steve Bucci, he served our nation for 3 decades as an Army Special Forces officer and top Pentagon official. He is the director of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Steve previously was a lead consultant for IBM on cybersecurity policy. He published numerous articles on related issues and regularly contributed to Security Debrief, a leading national security blog. He is a member of the advisory board for the Network Science Research Center, a consortium led by IBM and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Steve is also an association professor at Long Island University's Homeland Security Management Institute. Lindsay Burke researches and writes on federal and state education issues as the Will Skillman Fellow on Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Burke focuses on 2 critical areas of education policy: reducing the federal role in education and empowering families with school choice. Her work and commentary have been cited or appeared in national magazines such as The Atlantic, newspapers such as the Boston Herald and Washington Times, and digital venues such as the Daily Caller and National Review Online. Burke, who has spoken on education reform across the country and internationally, has also appeared on television programs like CNN and Fox News Channel, as well as national and regional radio. So thank you so much for our experts for being here today, and we will get started with our discussion. I'll sit down. So one of my first questions I have is for Jim, and this is going to be very casual. We're all just going to,
It's like The View.
yeah. I might point it at one person, but please feel free to jump in.
He could be whippical.
Exactly. So Jim's book is Surviving the End, A Practical Guide for the Everyday American in the Age of Terror. And it's new from PJ Media's Freedom Academy. And something that I found fascinating about your book is really the foundations and pillars of survival. I believe it's faith, family, education, and health. And I found that quite interesting because I think the everyday American is going to wonder how does that relate to their everyday lives in terms of knowing how to survive if one of these disaster takes place. So how does that apply?
Yeah, it's great. I know this is kind of really unusual for a book event since they didn't write the book, but so much of what my colleagues at Heritage did was really the inspiration for the book. And I thought this is a much more interesting conversation than just having me talk about the book. 'Cause one of the when they asked me to write the book, and I Steve and I, and actually Amber, we've all done a lot of Homeland Security work, thinking of the end of what do governments do, and not so much in terms of what do we as individuals do. So one of the things that really came as a surprise to me when I really thought about this is that fundamentally it's actually not about all the things you think about when people talk about survival, like having 500 pounds of Fry Street beef in your basement, it's really about lifestyle choices. And the lifestyle choices that you make are actually a much better predictor of who is actually likely to survive, not just the horrible, terrible things, but even kind of everyday catastrophes. So scientifically speaking, the most likely person to survive a disaster is a married, church-going, high school educated, gun-toting yoga instructor. And because kind of in there, no, because kind of in there are really kind of all the lifestyle choices that you make, which are really indicative of whether you're the kind of person to actually do well in that. So I mean, and I, point to Lindsay as an example. So education, right? So one of the things I discovered in the process of researching the book and writing this up is that you could have a 5,000-page book about everything you could do for hurricanes and avalanches and nuclear attacks and zombie hordes, but really what's much more valuable is the ability to make good, solid judgments on the spot. And what I found is really everything you need to know to make a reasonable judgment. If you looked at the science and everything else, is you really should have learned in high school. And so the reality is if you've had a decent high school education, you probably are a person that actually is capable of listening to reports on Ebola and making reasonable judgments to make yourself and your family first. And that's actually when I thought about Lindsay, because I said, well, okay, there's a presumption there that you have a decent high school education, which I don't think is much actually something you can really guarantee more. So what I talked about in the book was a lot of Lindsay's research about, well, what can you do as an individual to ensure that your children are actually adequately educated? And some of the things I talked about were charter schools and online education, where people can essentially take responsibility for their own education. So I actually wanted to ask Lindsay to talk a little bit about why is that something that's actually at risk in this country?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So a couple of thoughts on that, and you're absolutely right. I don't think we can make the presumption all the time that just because you've graduated high school, you are adequately prepared to move forward and to achieve what you hope will be a great career or whatever you define as your goals in life. I think that if you look at all of the sort of boring statistical outcomes that we see, right, that are provided by national data, that those data don't show that these schools, by and large, are adequately preparing kids. You look at the fact that a third of kids nationally can read at grade level. That's a huge problem if you're trying to use your example, to interpret something that you read about Ebola. I mean, a third of kids being able to read proficiently is a huge problem for being able to interpret and understand information, even at the most basic level. So I think that is certainly an apt example. When I have been thinking about this event and thinking in terms of the context of crisis and what that means, in particular for education and education systems and how we have structured them And of course, New Orleans immediately comes to mind. If you look at the impact of Katrina in New Orleans and the impact on the education system there, it was pretty devastating. But out of that devastation came something pretty incredible, which was a thriving private and public market of education options for kids. This is now in New Orleans the most market-based education system in the country. And so out of that devastation that hit the city, we saw something pretty impressive. And just to put a finer point on that, if you look at New Orleans pre-Katrina, so 2003, 2004, right before the storm hit in August of 2005. If you look pre-Katrina, the outcomes were pretty terrible, quite frankly. I mentioned about a third of kids nationally can read at grade level. Well, in the city of New Orleans, it was 2 in 10. 2 in 10 kids could read at grade level in New Orleans. That's pretty unacceptable, I think, by any measure. The graduation rate in about 2003, 2004 was 54%. Barely half of kids in New Orleans made it to graduation. And 2/3 of schools, not surprisingly, when you consider those outcomes, 2/3 of schools in the city were rated academically unsuccessful. So, you think about New Orleans, right? This fun place, terrible academic outcomes. And then you think, in the context of New Orleans, of what was already happening, then in 2005, Katrina befalls the city. And it was devastating for the public school system there. 65,000 public school kids in New Orleans were displaced as a result of the storm. Just a few images from post-Katrina New Orleans of the schools there. I mean, it was devastating. And this was a school system that was already struggling significantly. So you had 65,000 kids displaced, and the state of Louisiana came in and said, we're going to create something called the Recovery School District. And you think about the fact that, well, especially from a conservative standpoint, a state takeover might make you a little bit worried. But in New Orleans, they had some good market-oriented folks who decided to go in and convert the city's failing public government-run schools into charter schools. And so today, 100% of kids in New Orleans are enrolled in a school of choice. That might be a charter school, which makes up about 90% of the New Orleans education market. It might be a private school of choice. New Orleans also has a voucher program in place that provides scholarships to low-income kids to attend any private school of choice. So you have a really robust market in place in New Orleans. You can see that shows the proportion. The red line there is your traditional government school, your traditional public school. Circa 2004, it was basically all government schools. And today, it's much closer. About 90% of those were converted to charter schools. So just quickly, what did we see? We saw academic outcomes increase dramatically. Whereas you had 2 in 10 kids reading proficiently before the storm, after all of the reforms were put in place, we saw a 34 percentage point increase in the proportion of kids who are reading at grade level. And so today, New Orleans is on track to become the first high poverty or first low-income school district in the country to outperform the statewide average in reading and mathematics. So pretty impressive results. But it shouldn't take a disaster, a natural disaster, to implement these types of reforms and parental empowerment options.
But what I love about that is it really kind of gets to the 2 core messages of the book. One is it's really about the choices that you make that determine the kind of person you're going to behave in a disaster. But the behaviors are just not just applicable to disasters; they're applicable to everyday life. That are going to make you just a better person, a better citizen, regardless of whether there's a disaster or not. But the other thing is you cannot just assume that these things are happening. In many cases, if you want to have these advantages, you really have to take personal responsibility for your own life, which is also why I wanted to bring Jen the conversation, because 2 of the other pillars, and when I started, I didn't have any preconceptions about what these were. They just kind of evolved out of the research. But it turns out faith is hugely important. People of faith are actually better decision makers. They actually tend to be more decisive. They tend to be better ethical decision makers, and they actually tend to have lower levels of stress in stressful situations, and have higher immune systems. I mean, it's just so when you think about it, these are just all things that are really kind of handy to have around in a disaster. Family turns out to be enormously important because family is actually a very, very good predictor of how resilient not just you are, but your group is in terms of dealing with things. And that's kind of your part of the world. So I thought that this is kind of a perfect fit to a lot of the work you guys have done, particularly the work that comes out in the index.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. And it's interesting because we refer to people in the fire department and police and emergency teams as first responders. But I think what Jim's pointing to here is a first line of defense in family and a faith community and a neighborhood and so on. A first line of defense where you look for your help when something is about to happen. This is kind of common sense, even if you're guarding yourself against personal risk. When you leave the house and you think you left the iron on, you call back home and get the family to turn it off or get the roommate to turn it off. The more and more we live alone, the more and more we don't have that kind of family stability, family network. Just little things like that fall through the cracks, and you have less protection around you, less places to turn for those kinds of immediacy of need and help. In terms of the ways that the faith community in particular can be helpful, Jim and I did some work together in the wake of Katrina and particularly looked at the role of faith-based and community organizations partnering with emergency government services and others, but particularly the distinctives of these faith-based groups. And several things that we noted about their work and presence that was a differential. Number one, spiritual relief. These crises are literally that, crises all the way down to our core, often existential crises. About even the title of your book, thinking about the end. As we anticipate disaster, that makes us ask certain questions about our mortality, certain questions about our existence and our existence hereafter. And faith communities in particular help us to think those through and to make those commitments and have an understanding and resolution about what the future holds and our confidence in that. So that spiritual relief in the wake of a disaster as well, where maybe loved ones were lost. How do you process that? That is a deep, deep challenge. And being able to speak with spiritual resources into those tragedies is something that ministries can offer that a government agency, for example, would not be able to. Second distinctive is that faith-based organizations often have a greater deal of public confidence than does a government agency from the state capitol or from Washington, D.C. They are known, their names are known, often the people who are behind them are known, and they have a greater degree of public confidence. So even when a government agency, an emergency team is coming in, partnering with a faith-based organization is advantageous for that reason, because they are partnering with people who are known quantities in the community. Third distinctive was infrastructure. The fact that when a faith-based or community organization has been active on the ground for some time, they're going to have that network of contacts, the infrastructure to be able to get things done. Otherwise, they don't exist in the first place if they aren't already active in getting things done. So that infrastructure is something that can be tapped in partnerships. And then finally, these groups have the staying power. They are often of the community and in the community, and they're going to be there after the disaster teams leave. That, again, reaps returns in all those other categories as well. They have confidence because of that, because they're going to be there when the flood subsides for the second and third and fourth degrees of grief that families are going to go through. And so that's going to earn greater input and engagement from people in the community, and is why it's wise for government organizations to particularly be thinking ahead of the disaster about how to partner with these kinds of organizations. So a few thoughts on that, and
Yeah,
happy
and
to
what I
engage
thought
more.
was interesting too is just like with education, you can't presume that these things are going to be there for you, because both the institutions of faith and family
That's right.
are really under pressure now.
This is why it's so important that we are committing ourselves as a country, policymakers, policy organizations, really investing in these bedrock institutions of our society, of marriage and family and faith communities, making sure we're preserving the religious liberty for these faith-based organizations to do their good work. And that is no longer something we can take for granted. We've had a number of policies that have begun to erode religious freedom, have actually driven out groups like Catholic Charities and evangelical adoption agencies that have certain commitments with regard to marriage and the family, and because that didn't coincide with new laws of the jurisdictions in which they were operating, they've been driven out of that market in several jurisdictions, and right here in D.C. and in Boston and Illinois. And that's a great shame for us that we would not respect the religious liberty of organizations like that, because we need all the help we can get and all the diversity of options for people to turn to, particularly in that case for children in need, but for these unforeseeable kinds of situations that we know will face us in the future. Moreover, making sure that we are concerned about the state of the family and about the strength and resilience of the family. As we see more than 4 out of 10 children born outside of marriage today, living with a single parent, that's going to, that depletes the resources that you can bring into a crisis situation like this. We need to be doing everything we can to affirm and to restore the stability of the family in our nation.
And can I just add one thing to that? She triggered a couple of thoughts, but on that family component, one of the absolute best ways we have seen to increase parental involvement in a child's education is through choice. And there is fantastic research that has been developed in particular by Patrick Wolf at the University of Arkansas, who has taken the time to do rigorous evaluations of existing choice programs and found that, I think, one of his most beautiful findings was that parents move from the margins to the centers of their child's academic life when they are empowered with choice options. And so I do think, just piggybacking off of what Jen said, that's why it's so critical that, and what Jim said as well, why we start to shift away from this notion of institutional funding toward funding the child and really empowering families to choose from among a host of educational options, delivery models, whether that's homeschooling, charter schooling, online learning. There are so many options out there now. So really changing the way we think about financing education to make sure that it is student-centered and portable.
Yeah, so that's why I thought it was really important to have these guys here, because I don't think when people open a book on disaster preparedness, that they think they're going to be faced with a kind of a very important discussion about how you live your life is really determined.
Yeah,
whether you're gonna be
absolutely.
successful
I
or not.
think when the first thing you think of survival, you don't immediately think education or faith, but it is interesting to see that it is one of the pillars to surviving a huge disaster or a terrorist attack. And I think one of your messages of self-sufficiency and independence sort of plays throughout the book in terms of stepping away from government dependence and thinking when disaster does strike that they're going to be the first ones there to save you and take care of you, just as Lindsay mentioned about the best example we have is Hurricane Katrina, and so I think that's a message that we continually should discuss on ways that you can become self-sufficient in times of disaster. But Steve, I wanted to ask you a question as our cyber expert. We saw with the recent Sony hacking incident with the movie The Interview. Do you think, in terms of cyber crime, are we going to only see this increase? Are threats only going to become more consistent, and not just towards huge corporations or political figures, but to the everyday American? And what are ways that we can do to sort of prevent them from happening?
Well, it's going to increase. It's frankly way bigger than everybody thinks already. We just don't see most of it, and it isn't just the obvious targets. I love whenever I talk about this with people and they say, well, but I don't have anything anybody wants, so I don't have to worry about it. You're dreaming if you think that's the case. I mean, I've heard corporations say that, and they're really nutty because they do have a lot of stuff that everybody wants. Each person in this room has something that somebody wants, even if it's just your social security number and your identity. But there's a lot of other things too. We all carry these multitudes of devices. I carry like 3 or 4 devices everywhere I go that are constantly able to connect with the internet. Most of you do as well. Even my wife, who is a closet Luddite and she doesn't really like technology, well, she finally broke down and we got her an iPhone and she's got that, and now, you know what, she actually turns it on and uses it, unlike her little flip phone, which she left turned off all the time. But you got to remember, every one of these devices are computers, right? They're not just a phone. They're not just a tablet. They are computers. They're just computers that fit in your pocket or your purse, and they can be exploited. I write a lot about cyber personal hygiene, and what you need to do. And to be honest with you, there's a lot of cyber experts who say, that's a waste of time. We really can't make every citizen a computer scientist, so why bother? I think that's really short-sighted, because I've talked to a lot of folks around the country, and most Americans want to be part of the solution, or at least they want to get themselves out of being part of the problem. And you need to be able to do that. We live and die off of these darn things nowadays. It's how we communicate. It's how we keep track of each other. I love, there was this story of the kid who fell in the storm drain. And instead of, he had some kind of device, instead of calling 911, he tweeted that he had fallen into a storm drain. And all of a sudden, a bunch of people came and helped get him out. But that was the way this young man, that's how he communicated. He didn't communicate with a telephone. He communicated through Twitter. And there's a lot of that goes on. So we need to be, first of all, you need to be wise. You need to think before you do things. You really need to get off of this idea that, no one's going to come after you, nobody's going to bother you, because they will. Second, you need to put protective software on these devices, even your phone. All right? It's a computer too. It needs to be protected. It needs to have a password. And you need to keep that stuff updated. You need to patch it when you get that annoying thing because you open up your computer and you want to fix something and write a letter or write an email and whoop, you need to update this. You need to do it right then, all right? Because you're already behind the power curve by the time you get the announcement. If you keep saying, no, I'll do it later, that's just more and more opportunities for the bad guys to get you. You need to have real passwords, right? Don't use password or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? The bad guys check those first before they go in there.
Damn it.
Yeah. And you can't use the same one for everybody. For those of you who get, so how am I going to remember all of them? If it's in your house, you can put it on a sticky note next to your computer, right? You don't want to do that at work, but in your house you can. I can tell you the bad guys are not going to break into your house and then try and break into your computer. They're going to take the computer and leave. All right? So it's okay if you can't remember, write them down. But don't do that in your office. That's a bad idea. But you do have to change them. And on your banking stuff, when they ask you those security questions, like what's your mother's maiden name, it's not a test. Don't use your mother's real maiden name, because the bad guys go and look that stuff up and then use it to go change your passwords themselves. So you can use Smith if your mother's maiden name is Marcotti or something. Right? That's okay.
Does that work for you?
Yeah, you got to remember that.
I have some work to do.
You got to do some work. Yeah, you'll get a lot of calls. If you see something weird pop up, don't click on it. Right? If it's if you get a thing, say, hey, this is cool, click on this. Don't. Right? That's a trap. Even if it's from somebody that you think you know. If it's your buddy's name, send your buddy a separate email and say, hey, Bob, did you send this to me? Don't do this anymore. Right? Write it differently. But when you get those, don't click on them, even if it's something good. Wi-Fi, be careful where you use it. No offense to Starbucks and all those places, don't use their Wi-Fi. They're all infected by dudes sitting in their cars out there eating up all your stuff when you join them. All right? Even if they have a password for the store, that's a bad thing to use. Hotel ones are really bad too, particularly in places that have big conferences. They're all pre-infected, not by the hotel, by other bad guys. And honestly, if the hair on your neck goes up when you open up an email, just delete it. If it's really from somebody important, they'll send you another one. That's what my mother used to say about phone calls. You miss one, if it's really important, they'll call back. Same thing with emails. Don't click on something that's suspicious. Even the Chinese, who are the most egregious cyber hacker nation in the world, right? Their main way of getting into networks is to send you an email that looks like it came from Jim Carafano if you work here at Heritage, and we click on it and then they're in. Now, once they get in there, they do some pretty fancy high-speed stuff, but getting in is pretty meat and potatoes. And you don't want to lose that capability, particularly in an emergency, because at least until all the batteries die, that may be your only way of communicating. And you probably should have some backups, because if all the electricity goes down, so does your Wi-Fi. Right? Even if you got juice in the phone, the network doesn't work. So keep that in mind when you look at this stuff. But be wise, be smart, help other people, your families, old guys like me, help us. Don't just leave us out there flapping. Little kids, they're using these things. You got to teach them the right things to do as well, and that means you need to know it first. So be smart.
Because, can I just add a point
Yeah.
Because it really does connect back to kind of Jen and Lindsay's work. So one of the things I did in the book is I went through and I picked the most horrific disasters you could possibly imagine. So like nuclear attacks and, zombie plagues and
When do we get into the zombies?
cyber program stuff. But the reason for that and this is pretty remarkable, and I actually, when they asked me to do that, I kind of focus on this really high-end stuff because it's kind of sexy, I guess. But one of the things I discovered is, much like discovering lifestyle is really the foundation of this, is there are actually so many practical things that you can do in the worst of times that would actually significantly impact your survival, like a lot of the stuff that Steve talked about in the cyber world. And the point is you may never face a nuclear attack, but if these skills are actually going to make you safer in the worst of times, they're going to help you out in everyday disasters, and they're going to help you out in your everyday life. So you may never face a cyber Pearl Harbor, but you're likely as not going to face the thing of somebody trying to hijack your BB&T account and take all the money out. And so one of the things I try to distill in the book is not just kind of these fundamental lifestyle choices that you need to make, but just kind of the common sense, everyday things you can do to make your life better. But one of the interesting things that I found was, as I tried to, explain that as, I try to put it in language even Bucci can understand, which is hard when you're working with Bucci stuff, right? So and the cyber thing's really interesting because there must be a million lists out there about the things, and to take all those things and kind of boil them down into, what's really practical and make it very, very accessible. At some point, you just kind of get to the irreducible, and I'm just sitting there thinking like, if you're not a high school graduate, I don't care how simplistic I write this up, you're not going to get this and understand this. And even faith and family are good issues. So hacking is a good example, right? Not everybody around the world hacks equally. There are countries where people don't hack at all. And they don't hack at all because it's not an appropriate thing to do. It's a bad behavior. It's a behavioral thing. So these are, kind of cultural choices as well. So, at some point there's this merger between how you live your life and good practical knowledge, which actually does, I think, kind of put you in a league of your own in terms of how well you're going to do in a Katrina or something else.
And I think in terms of being practical, too often today in American society, we see The Walking Dead, we see doomsday preppers, and it very much has this Hollywood component to these type of disasters, so much that people that do prepare almost have this bad reputation for being conspiracy theorists or just out there. And I think that basically this applies to all categories, community, family, cyber, survival in general. How can we sort of change that narrative from Hollywood entertainment and basically outside of reality to something that, a nuclear attack, a dirty bomb, a terrorist attack, all of these events that we could face just in our everyday lives as Americans today?
I'll go first. Look, the main thing is to think, right? We talked here we're a public building here at Heritage, so I've talked to the people that work for me about, well, what the heck do we do if a person gets in here with a weapon, right? The shooter thing, active shooters scenario. And, everybody goes, oh my gosh, that's terrible. How can we even think about that? You're going to scare everybody. No, you need to think about it. Because I can tell you, I've been in, crisis situations before. It's not the time to think about it for the first time. You're not at your best in that situation. Now, I'll be honest with you, you can do it, you can think about it, you can rehearse it, you can practice it. It still doesn't go that way in real life. It's different. And Amber knows, combat, it's different than training. The good guys get hurt and that sort of thing. But you're really in a deep pit if you have never thought about it before. So you need to think about these things based on your faith, based on your education, based on what you do on a daily basis, and walk yourself through it. It helps. because when it really happens, maybe only do one of the 8 things that you've decided you're gonna do when it happens, but that's one more than you would have done if you hadn't thought about it. So you really need to be realistic. Stuff does happen, folks, even to nice people. And you really have to get yourself there. Don't be depressed. Don't think, oh my God, the sky is falling. But think about what might happen and walk yourselves through it. You'll do much better when something bad does happen, and so will all the people around you, because you'll drag a bunch of them with you who haven't thought about it before.
I was in New York City yesterday, and at Penn Station, they have a video rolling on the video screens in the main hall there. Maybe some of you have seen it, where it's preparation for an active shooter. They're actually taking you, and it's a dramatization, not particularly high quality, but it does show you, like, get behind the pillar, silence all your phones, and walks you through step by step. And now let's summarize. What do we do? 1, 2, 3, 4. And I was kind of surprised to see that. My first reaction was, ooh, that's kind of morbid to contemplate. But the second reaction is, well, we all ought to think it through for just the reasons that you said, Steve. We don't like to contemplate these eventualities, but we need to. And we need to do that as families. We need to, have a plan. If I can't get through to you, if something happened to me, all these kinds of things. It's the same reasons that we don't like to write a will. We don't like to contemplate that eventuality, that all of us will die, and that we need to wrestle with that reality, wrestle with it practically, wrestle with it spiritually, because our understanding of that will have an effect on our nerves at those moments when we are facing crisis. So I think all these factors are extremely important, and we live in a culture that is very risk averse. We've talked a lot about this as a policy organization. We want to eliminate all possibility of risk, and we particularly would like to outsource that to somebody else to do for us. And this is, if this panel is anything, it's about taking personal responsibility, taking responsibility as families, as communities. Nobody else can do this for us when it comes down to our individual lives. And we will not be able to avoid all risks. The fact is, what are we going to do when we face those?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It actually gets to, there's another problem in this, was just kind of with the disaster preparedness literature, and it's the political correctness problem, and we've seen that in the.
Yeah.
If you think about what we typically get research and stuff, there is a political correctness problem. There are things which are simply put out of bounds, which you sit there and scratch your head and you go, why don't we talk about these things? So faith and family is a good thing. You don't find me a disaster preparedness guy that talks about the value of faith and family. Well, that's not appropriate to talk about those things. But they're central to our survival. Why wouldn't you talk about them? So another one, I never thought about this. All the years I've studied this, and if you guys seem different, let me know. I've looked through every FEMA guide, every Red Cross guide, and nowhere at all does it talk about self-defense. And if you think through disasters, there are many disasters where whether it's a terrorist attack or where you think, or something like Katrina, where you're worried about the safety and security of your home because the police aren't there or they can't get to you or something, where self-defense is actually a very kind of reasonable kind of component of disaster preparedness. They don't talk about anything about that. They don't talk about gun ownership, which is kind of nutty. I mean, owning a gun is a perfectly sensible and responsible self-defense protection measure. And I would defy you to open up one Red Cross book where they say, go get a gun, dude. And so one of the things I talk about in the book, which is, okay, if owning a gun is a responsible component of you're taking personal responsibility for yourself and your family, how do you do that responsibly? And so I talk through, what are the ways, do you know the gun laws in your state, right? Do you know where to go to get a gun safety class? Do you know how to maintain a gun, how to practice it? Steve talked about actor shooter. There's a big difference between taking a gun on a range and shooting a target and using a gun where somebody might be trying to shoot back at you, or there might be innocent people standing around. And if you're planning on, if you think you might have to use the gun in that scenario, you need specific training for that thing. So I think political correctness is a huge problem in the disaster preparedness realm. Just as big as the problem with, there's nothing wrong with preppers. So there are like TV shows now. Right. So we have survivalists, we have preppers, people who are preparing for the end. We have homesteaders, which are those are people that want to live off the grid, and I think there's nothing wrong with any of that. because we live in a free country and people are free to do whatever they want. But I actually look at those as kind of lifestyle choices. Those are people that are practicing things which, for whatever reason, they find rewarding, and that's fine. Maybe it teaches some independence, and maybe there's some useful skill there. But that's not fundamental to how most of us are going to survive, and what most of us need to know and are going to do. And so I think, in many ways, this is an anti-prepper book. I mean, I think the notion that somehow you need to be some kind of survivalist to do this isn't true. But the notion that you can basically listen to the government, which really wants you to be a victim, that they're going to come and rescue. I don't think that's right either. I mean, I think we need to recreate the space of how people think about disaster preparedness in this country.
And in terms of sort of being responsible for your family and not wanting to go to the extremes that we just talked about, it seems like most people are, and you talk about this in your book, spend more time and more money planning a family vacation than they do going into any sort of disaster preparedness, including a disaster kit or an emergency kit to just always have in your house. So really, what are ways that people can do to sort of put together those kits and be prepared on just a general, standard, normal level without going to those extremes that we see on TV?
Yeah, well, I'd say one of the things I actually found is, so it's funny because somebody at Heritage came to me. I don't want to tell you who it was because that would be violating confidence. So Bert Bernhard came to me and said, so Brett said, he said, yeah, so you got this book out. He goes, I have a disaster preparedness kit. I go, that's really cool. He said, yes, so after 9/11, we ran out and got one. I said, where is it? He goes, I don't know. And I'm thinking, like, even if he knew where it was, right? If you think about it, if there's food in there, it's long past expired. If there's water in there, contained water after that is no good anymore. If there's medicine in there, it's completely expired. So if the batteries are in there, they've melted by now, right? So the odds are that 90% of that kit is probably useless. And look, a lot of us, don't, you might live in a small apartment, you don't have room for this stuff. You're a low-income person, you can't afford this stuff. So here's one of the interesting experiments I did is I went through the average American household, and I consolidated lists of all these things that, FEMA says you should have and everybody else. And I went through the average American household, and here's what I found. About 99% of what, FEMA or the Red Cross says you need to have in your kit, you already have in your household. So why should you run around having a kit in the basement? If you would just have this kind of inventory and just made sure that, routinely you kind of replenish these things in your household, the odds are, that stuff's actually going to be more usable, right? Because you're going to be switching out the batteries and everything else. And look, okay, if a disaster happens, take 5 minutes, go around the house, collect this stuff up, and you're good to go. But other than having something in your car, which obviously, would make sense, the notion that you need to do something super special in your household just to be ready is not. And then, it's nice to have toilet paper in the household anyway, So most of the stuff you probably need. Yeah.
And, you think about it, I bought some first aid packs, pre-done ones. I have one little one I carry in my briefcase with me everywhere I go, so I don't hurt myself doing my crazy things. In my car, I have a slightly bigger one. In my wife's car, I have a really big detail one because my wife's a nurse. And she can do lots of stuff with that stuff. You tell me to intubate somebody,
right.
I'm not going to do that, right? She knows how to do it. So there's an intubation tube in her kit. Flashlights. They make flashlights. I carry one everywhere I go that are this long, this big around, that can light up the night, right? You don't have to have a big giant mag light that weighs 40 pounds anymore. They're not cheap if you get a good one, but they're real handy and they're small. You need that. If the lights go out here, you want to be able to do it. Here's a simple one. How many of you have alternate routes to go home, right, if you drive? Most of you know one way to get in and out of the city. If that road goes down, you're totally stuck. We saw that on 9/11. We've seen it other times. You need to know alternate routes, how to get to the important places you need to go to. You need to have alternate ways of communicating. My wife, bless her heart, her first day in the Pentagon was September 11th, 2001. That was her first day on the job, right? Our kids had been going to their school for a week at that point. She had no idea. She couldn't even hardly remember the name of the school, let alone the number to tell them what was going on. The only number she could remember was her best friend who lives in northern Michigan. So she called her in northern Michigan. She finally remembered the name of the school and said, look, I don't have any idea what the number is. Here's the name of the kid's school. Figure out the number, call the school, tell them to send the boys home. and that she was okay. She had no communication with me. She didn't know if I was alive. I didn't know if she was alive. But she had the presence of mind to figure out an alternative way to get that message to our kids so they could get home. I was really proud of her. That was pretty darned amazing. Nurses are pretty handy in emergencies in a lot of ways, but you need to think about that kind of stuff. What are those alternatives for you? You don't have to have a whole basement full of dried beans, but you got to have some thought as to what you're going to do in whatever that generic emergency is.
Yeah, I actually, a really good point, kind of ties back to some of the work that Lindsay has done. There's a really interesting study that was done a couple years ago by a woman in New York, and they went out and they surveyed the disaster management plans, because most disaster management plans are written without us. They're written by professional people, which are going to tell us what to do. There's disaster. So in virtually all these disaster plans, says the number one thing it says is don't go to the school and get your kid. So then they did a survey of people that lived in these communities, and they said, what's the first thing you're going to do when there's a disaster? And they said, well, I'm going to the school to get my kid, right? So the point is a lot of this disaster preparedness stuff is done in absence of the people that supposedly it's really going to affect, which is why places like Katrina were such a mess and a disaster and everything. So community involvement in these things makes it much, much better. But it goes back to the education thing. It's the difference between communities where people take responsibility and ownership for their own education, vice where people who are professional and know so much better than come in and tell them what to do.
Yeah, so which triggered a thought too on the community involvement piece. We have probably the best example of community involvement in education in Arizona. In Arizona, we have seen this kind of civil society of education really flourish. There is a mother in Arizona who, in the wake of the creation of what I would say is the most innovative school choice option to date, known as education savings accounts, which I can explain in a second, but in the wake of this option, she decided to start her own Yahoo account and to be able to work with other families and communicate with other mothers and fathers in Arizona to discuss how the accounts worked, what's an allowable use. And she did that all on her own as a way to communicate and has really increased community engagement in their local education options. And, excuse me, that came in the wake of Arizona creating these education savings accounts, which, just briefly, if you think about how we have kind of traditionally thought about school choice, that it comes in the form of a scholarship or a voucher or tuition tax credit option, a charter school. What Arizona did, and now Florida, which just became the second state to do it earlier this fall, Arizona said, okay, you as a parent can have 90% of what the state would have spent on your child's education in the public system. If for whatever reason your public school that was assigned to your kid is not meeting your child's needs, you can withdraw from the public system and you can have that money deposited onto a restricted use debit card. So that money literally goes onto a debit card that the parent controls. So if you think federal, state, local dollars, it's 90% of that state portion. Parents can then use that money to pay for private school tuition. If they want to do a half day at their local Catholic school, they can show up and swipe their card and pay tuition. They can pay for private tutors, online learning options. They can buy textbooks. They can purchase curricula. What is really cool about an ESA, and it's the only school choice option that does this, is it allows you to roll over unused funds from year to year. So an ESA actually encourages parents to think about all of these other things, opportunity costs. Am I getting a good value for the education option that I'm purchasing? What's particularly distinctive as well is that you can roll unused funds into a college savings account if you have money left over. So this is such an innovative way to approach school choice. It gets back to this whole notion of customized education, of separating the financing of education from how we deliver services. But to see that very innovative option, which was sort of new and it requires a little bit of conversation about how it works and what it looks like, and is different for people to think about in terms of a delivery and financing mode. Immediately in the wake of that, we saw this mother create that Yahoo account to talk to other mothers and fathers and to really understand, hey, can I use my ESA to purchase Rosetta Stone? And so to see that happen in real time just shows, how communities respond.
So here's what that has to do with a disaster. That community, even though they may have never, ever had a discussion about disaster planning, they're going to be more resilient and do better in a disaster than a community with, you know, a 700-page disaster plan written by, you know, Booz Allen. And the reason for that is because of all the things that we talked about, because people take personal ownership of that. For the same reason why, you know, Steve and his wife did better on 9/11 than other people, because they took personal ownership and responsibility for their actions. And that in the end is going to actually make them much more resilient than other people. So the same reason I think that another disaster in a very poor part of New Orleans, that community is going to respond infinitely better than last time, because what the data shows is communities that are cohesive and integrated and take responsibility for themselves, they do better in disasters, and it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. Poverty actually has, you know, income has nothing to do with it. It's cohesive communities that take responsibility for themselves do better in disasters, regardless of how big or small or wealthy or how many resources they have.
And I think, too, when you have that cohesive community, you do have sort of a private sector supply side response. If you look at New
Right, yeah.
Orleans, you know, right now parents have access to something called the One App program, for lack of a better word. And the One App allows you as a parent, you go online and you rank your top 8 schools. And so parents are seeing, you know, how are schools being ranked? Are they, you know, providing a good education? Are they safe schools? Do they provide all of these other options? And there has been a huge infusion of different providers in New Orleans. Teach for America, charter management organizations, New Schools for New Orleans. All of these different options have come to the fore because parents actually have options. They can vote with their feet. They communicate with one another. So I do think there's sort of a symbiotic relationship with both sides of that equation.
Yeah, absolutely great discussion. Sorry, we've reached the end of our time block for today, but thank you all so much for coming. We all know that threats are on the rise today around the world that we live in. So I think it's a smart idea for everybody to pay attention to, just as we've discussed, your lifestyles and figuring out how that can better prepare you for any disaster that we face today. Jim's book is Surviving the End, A Practical Guide for the Everyday American in the Age of Terror. It's from PJ Media's Freedom Academy, and it can be downloaded at survivingtheendbook.com. So thanks again for coming.
Thank you. Thank you guys. We were talking about the zombie.